you, Florian. Yeah, today I'm going to talk about the corpus methodology, or a type of corpus methodology, when looking at and analysing and collecting linguistic data. So, the reasons I'm calling it as real as it gets is that I believe that using a corpus as a methodology of analysing and collecting data is one of the ways that we can get at the actual speech that people use, as opposed to looking at a theoretical idea of language. So, I'm going to divide the talk into roughly two parts. The first part, I'm going to talk about corpus methodology in general and how I helped a group collect 2 corpora, or even 3 corpora, over the years. And so, to help you, if you're interested in the future using the corpus methodology to collect and analyse linguistic data. And then I'm going to detail to you, in general terms, 2 linguistic studies which I took part in, one of which is my PhD study, and the other which is a study I did afterwards with other people. And then, for people who want to stay, there'll be a short and unthreatening workshop on transcribing spoken language and the challenges that involves. So just, Florian has explained what I do now, but just give you a brief idea of my background. My undergraduate and master degrees were in Cambridge. I got in Cambridge in Anglo-Saxon, Norse and Celtic studies. So my background is actually in historical language. But I got my PhD in linguistics, specifically in bilingualism, Welsh-English bilingualism, in Bangor last year. And nowadays my specialism is in bilingualism, specifically bilingual grammar and the linguistics of Welsh, and language content and language change as well. During my research, particularly during my PhD research, I helped collect, during my PhD research I helped collect 1 corpus, and afterwards I helped collect another corpus as well. So that's what I'm going to talk to you about today, my experiences in corpus collection. The corpus that I helped collect, in fact the 3 corpora I'm going to talk to you about today, were all corpora collected in order to analyse code switching. So I'm just going to talk briefly about code switching. Broadly and briefly speaking, code switching is the use of multiple languages in the same conversation or even in the same utterance, in the same sentence. We can divide it into 2 types, intrasentential, within a sentence, within an utterance, or intersentential, from one sentence to another. So, an example of intrasentential code switching would be something like, "Dwi'n love your television." So here, this is a sentence with both Welsh and English words in it. It means, "I love television," you know. You'll see that some of the words "love" and "television" are from English, the rest are from Welsh. But certainly within the first clause, you have both English and Welsh words. So that is a type of intrasentential code switching, where the switching, the mixture of languages, happens within the same clause. The second type is intersentential, which is where from one sentence or from one utterance or from one clause to the other, you change languages. So an example of this would be with the same meaning, "Dwi'n caru teledu," you know. So here, this clause, "Dwi'n caru teledu," meaning "I love television," is wholly in Welsh. And then for the tag clause, you know the speaker switches to English. So that would be intersentential between sentences. So there's lots of literature on code switching, and I'm not going to go into it. But the literature, the studies that people have done frequently return to the issue of constraints on code switching, whether or not there are constraints. That is, whether or not speakers can use words from both languages willy-nilly in a sentence, or whether or not there are grammatical rules that constrain which words and which types and categories of words you can use. And so, one question we can ask is, how unlimited in its flexibility is code switching? And also, code switching is something that we can link to language change. We can ask if code switching plays a role in language change, as in if speakers use code switching frequently and switch structure as well as words, perhaps, does that lead to significant and widespread change in one of the languages that they speak? Now, you can analyse and study code switching using a variety of different methods, I suppose. But crucially, code switching is a phenomenon of informal speech. It's done only by bilinguals, at least language code switching is, and it's only done in informal context. Primarily, if you code switch in a formal context, it's considered inappropriate. And so you need to find a methodology of collecting your data that reflects this. For example, a lot of the early and also influential studies of code switching have taken an approach where you find people and record them having conversations. So the important studies by Poplack and Myers-Scotton are amongst the studies that have taken that kind of approach to analysing code switching. So when we approach the study or the idea of studying code switching, we need to ask ourselves what methodologies might work and what methodologies might not work so well. So if we bear in mind that code switching is a feature, it's a reflex of informal speech and informal discourse, some methodologies don't lend themselves so well, arguably, to that kind of context. So for example, experimental settings, where you set up some kind of experiment or test or game, where you somehow elicit code switching from speakers. Because any experimental setting is going to be reasonably formal, it's generally the case that you don't find much code switching in those kind of settings. So experimentally, you may not get natural types of code switching if you use some kind of experiment. However, you can try and elicit code switching or responses to code switching by experimental settings. So I've been involved recently in ERP experiments of code switching, where you attach electrodes to people's heads and measure their brain reactions when you produce various types of sentences in front of them on a computer screen, and see how they respond to monolingual versus the code switching sentences. So it's doable, but if you want naturally occurring code switching, maybe this is the best approach. And for similar reasons, the idea of getting grammaticality judgments, which is popular in generative syntax literature, that is a reasonably formal way of eliciting data or judgments on code switching. So, because when you ask people to do grammaticality judgments, usually what you're doing is asking them whether or not they believe something is grammatical or acceptable. And there's quite a lot of stigma against code switching in many societies, for example in Wales. And so if you give a sentence of code switching to a speaker and ask them to judge it's correct, even if it is grammatical, then they will possibly say that it isn't grammatical. So people have done research on code switching using the generative approach of using grammaticality judgments as a form of data collection. But I argue that it's not necessarily the right kind of level of formality to put the speakers in. So this leads us to argue that if you want to record code switching, which occurs primarily in informal natural speech, then you want to find some kind of methodology that captures that informal setting. And so a corpus of conversational data is an ideal way of getting that kind of informal language, and therefore the most likely methodology, I argue, to get code switching data, if that's what you're after. You might not be aware of what exactly a corpus is, because the corpus might vary from discipline to discipline. Of course, it comes from the Latin for body, so it's like a body of data or evidence, and data which are in some way similar. So, for example, if you're collecting a corpus of informal conversations, then you'll have just a lot of examples of conversations between people probably in the same language or in similar settings. So there are lots of corpora which are publicly available, or available if you seek them out. They include, but are not limited to, things like the Corpus of Contemporary American English, the COCA, which is a very widely used corpus. The SPLOC corpus, the Spanish Learner Language Oral Corpus, actually it's more than one of them, so they're corpora. So that's bilingual Spanish-English data by people of various levels of ability in Spanish and English. And also in Welsh, the Cronfa Electronic Gymraeg, the Welsh Electronic Corpus, which is Not spoken language, but written language. So it's a collation of lots of Welsh language data from lots of different sources, so formal and informal written sources collected together. So you can have corpora of spoken and written language and anything in between. And also a corpus can be constrained or unconstrained, in that you could theoretically get a corpus where you've just asked people to talk about anything they like. So the topics of the various conversations within your corpus is going to be extremely varied. Or you can get a corpus of people, lots of people doing roughly the same thing. So the Frog's English slogan corpus, for example, basically has lots of different people responding to the same story about a frog. So you're going to get the same or similar lexical items, similar kind of register of language, perhaps. So that kind of corpus allows you to have some regularity. But the benefit of an unconstrained corpus would be that you get a lot of variety, if that's what you're looking at. So during my time in Bangor, I've helped collect 2 corpora, and I've been involved with a research group which has collected a 3rd corpora. So this was as part of both the Bilingualism Centre in Bangor, the ESRC Centre for Research in Bilingualism in Theory and Practice, and also as part of a research group funded by the AHRC, the Arts and Humanities Research Council, from 2005 to 2010. So with both groups, I and other researchers have collected these 3 corpora. So the 3 corpora are all bilingual corpora, so they're all collections of conversations between bilingual speakers. But the difference between the 3 corpora is that the language pairs are different, so the types of bilinguals, like the languages that bilinguals speak, vary. So the Siarad corpus is of Welsh-English conversational data by Welsh-English bilinguals. Siarad is Welsh for speak or talk. The size of this corpus is 40 hours of audio, which has been transcribed, and the audio consists of conversations between usually 2 speakers and a total of 151 speakers. The second corpus is called the Miami corpus, and this was collected data from Spanish-English bilinguals living in Miami in the United States. There's lots of Spanish spoken throughout the United States, but particularly in Miami. This has fewer participants and is a smaller corpus, but it's still the same setting, still conversational data between a couple or 3 people. And finally, the Patagonia corpus is a corpus of data collected from Welsh-Spanish bilinguals living in the old Welsh colony in Argentina. This is a 20-hour corpus and has data from 92 participants. And again, follows the same general methodology as the others. So the idea we had was that many corpora are not easily comparable, because if different corpora, different researchers use different methodologies to collect the corpus data, then maybe the settings are different, maybe the instructions given to the participants are different. So if you have 2 completely isolated corpora, maybe they're not immediately comparable. But if what we wanted to do is have 3 corpora which you could quite easily compare, because the methodology used was very similar, because the transcription system used is the same, and because the intention is the same. So if you wanted to compare Welsh-English bilinguals to Spanish-English bilinguals, we wanted to give you the opportunity to do that. And so the general idea of the corpus was a collection of conversations, each conversation maybe around half an hour, between 2 people usually, but sometimes you had more than 2, so sometimes 3 people. The biggest, I think, is between 6 or 7 people, but primarily we wanted a low number, ideally 2, because the more people you have, the more they talk over one another, and if you want to analyse individual speakers, ideally you want quite a lot of information from each individual speaker. This is the Siarad website. We call it Siarad website, but actually it contains access to all the corpora in various stages of construction, because the Miami and the Patagonia corpora are still, the Siarad corpus is complete, the Welsh-English corpus is complete, the other corpora are still works in progress. You can go to this website, www.siarad.org.uk, and you can access the corpora there. You could also go to talkback.org and access the corpora there. So you can download them. This website also has search functions if you want to search for certain words or certain types of sentences or something like that. So I'm just going to go through a few of the steps that we went through in order to collect and build these corpora. The first step when you're collecting any data is to think about how to find participants. And sometimes it can be easy, most times it's very hard because you need specific types of people. So if you're looking for Welsh-English bilinguals in Wales, then you need to find people who can speak both Welsh and English and who are crucially willing to take part in your study. And in some areas, some countries, some regions, finding speakers is harder than others because your pool, if you like, of speakers is smaller. So in Wales, around 20% of the population speak Welsh, so you're limited to 1 in 5 people on average. And also you're limited to people who are available and findable and want to take part in your study. But in some places it's even harder. For example, in Argentina, in Patagonia, where we collected the Welsh-Spanish data, we found that the community was quite dispersed. So you don't have particular towns where everybody speaks Welsh. You have to travel quite far and wide in order to find these people. And so those kind of challenges can face us when we're collecting large amounts of data from a lot of speakers. So for example, for the Welsh corpus, Welsh-English corpus, we had to find 151 speakers, so that's how many we found in the end. And it took us 2 years to find and record that amount of speakers. And what we realized was that there's no one form of finding participants that will always work in every context. You need to adapt the format of the data, of the participant finding that you use to suit the communities that you're in. So, for example, in Wales, we realised that a lot of the Welsh language activity happens in the small communities. So we used things like community centres, local libraries, sort of youth groups or choirs, and passed messages around there. We also used put adverts in the Corpora, which are local newspapers, but kind of very local newspapers, if you like, the very small photocopied kind that kind of get passed around all the houses, so that we could access people who we know are going to speak Welsh and are going to be perhaps providing their information or their services to a study. So that worked reasonably well in Wales. In Patagonia, because this community is quite spread out, and was spread out over a really large area, because it's Argentina, right? We realised that we couldn't just sort of put an advert up in a post office and hope that people would see it. We needed to be very proactive. So we found informants and helpers in the area, and we used their social network. So we asked them who they knew and made lists of people that they knew, access people that way. So if you know people in the area already, and people who are keen to help you and have lots of local knowledge, then that's a great way of finding participants. And in Miami, I wasn't directly involved with making this corpus, but I worked with the researchers who were, and they'd recruited, before the Bangor researcher went out to Miami, they'd recruited some undergraduates from the local university to sort of go out beforehand and find some participants so that they could build up, again, some kind of register of local people who are interested, and again use this social network approach to find interested parties. The most successful route that we took, or the method that we used to collect data, was the what you might call the friend-to-friend approach, which is similar to something proposed by Milroy in 1980. This approach is kind of like a daisy chain approach, where you find one participant and you record them, or you get whatever data they are willing to provide. And then afterwards you ask them to nominate one or more people who they think might be interested in taking part. And what we usually found was that even though people were initially a bit nervous to take part in an experiment because they had no idea what it would involve, afterwards they'd be much more relaxed, having realised it wasn't incredibly painful, and that they could then be, well, they'd be willing to tell their friends about your study. So that can work quite well, usually, we found. There are lots of aspects of data collection, or data recording perhaps, that you have to take on board when you're recording conversations for a corpus. And crucially to us is, because we were analysing code switching, because we were aware that code switching happens most frequently in informal contexts, we wanted to make sure that we could set up as natural, as real, as realistic a setting as possible. Because it is unethical to simply record people without their knowing, which of course would be the most natural idea, we needed to set up a situation for our participants, for our speakers, that would replicate a natural situation. So the kind of things that you have to bear in mind when setting such a situation is firstly the setting itself. So where you have your hard disk recorder or whatever and your microphone, but where are you going to record it? We gave speakers the option of where they could have the conversation once we found two people willing to take part. We would tell them, well, we can come to where you live, or we can go to somewhere neutral, like a cafe or a park bench or a coffee shop. Or you can come to our studio, to our recording studio. We had one at the university, and in Patagonia, we used our hotel lobby, which was and many participants were happy to come to us. So even though ideally in a sort of lab in the university it's not a particularly natural setting, if the participants were happy and felt comfortable there, then that was fine. But sometimes we would go to people's house and record them. Secondly, we wanted to make sure that the participants were speaking as informally as possible, and people who don't know one another well are less likely to speak informally to one another. So we realised that we had to get people who were close, so either close friends or family members, perhaps work colleagues who are friendly. And this meant that you wouldn't have to waste time trying to get them to ease into some kind of familiarity. That familiarity would already be present. So the way that we ensured this was usually by recruiting people singly. So we find a person who's willing to take part and ask them, can you now please find somebody that you were close to that you would like to converse with for our recording? And they would say, yes, okay, I'll do it with my friend or my sister or my work colleague. So that guaranteed that people knew each other, that we would get an informal, non-stigmatized speech. Thirdly, the formality of the setting was important. So we needed an informal setting. So we tried to make it as casual as possible, right? So we made sure that they sit in armchairs. We gave them cups of tea and didn't attach any microphones to their faces or pads to their heads. Right? And also, it was reasonably, we hoped that it was an unpressured situation, so we didn't use any scary terminology. We emphasised that we wanted it to be a casual, easy experience. The instruction that we gave as researchers beforehand to the participants to tell them what to do, this was also important. Because code switching has a certain stigma attached to it, particularly in some countries like in Wales, we wanted to make sure that the speakers weren't too aware that we were studying code switching. Because if we told them we're going to study how you mix English and Welsh, now go, they would probably then affect the way that they talk, even if subconsciously, based on the fact that they know what you're studying. Whether or not they increase the code switching because they think that you want to hear code switching, or whether or not they inhibit it because they're afraid of being judged. We didn't want that. So what we told participants was that we just want you to talk normally as you normally would to this person. Now, in Wales and Miami, frequently, most of the time, that resulted in quite a lot of casual code switching because bilinguals who know each other well do a lot of code switching to one another generally. But in Patagonia, what that resulted in was sometimes people speaking monolingual Spanish for half an hour, or at least or speaking monolingual Welsh. Now that's fine, of course, because that's natural discourse to them. But because, as we found out later, that code switching is really heavily judged, I suppose, in Patagonia, and they prefer to use some kind of pure language. The command to converse normally doesn't always elicit code switching, right? You will get what they do normally, whether or not that is what you want. And also the recording technique, the recording setup we had, we tried to be as inobtrusive as possible. So we used very small microphones that we hoped that the participants would forget about. We did not have the researcher in the room at the same time either. So for our microphones, we either used a tiny little recording device that you just put on a chair or on a table, or we used little radio mics with receivers in a separate room, so we could take the receivers and the recording machine into the adjacent room or down the next building along and record it without being in the same room. This addresses things like the observer's paradox, where if speakers are aware that there's a researcher staring at them while they're talking, they're going to somehow adjust the way that they speak, and you don't want that. You want them to be as real as possible. And also we were aware that in any sort of artificial setup like recording of this kind, you're likely to get some kind of first few minutes of any conversation is going to be a bit awkward because the speakers are suddenly being told to have a normal conversation, which is not going to necessarily be something they can immediately jump into. So when it came to us uploading the audio files to our computers, for every recording, regardless of what the quality of the first 5 minutes were, we would delete the first 5 minutes and not transcribe it and not include it in the corpus. This regularizes all the conversations, and also it means that any small talk, any awkwardness at the beginning is lost, and so every transcription jumps into the conversation in full flow. And also, we wanted to get extra linguistic information about the participants, their age, where they came from, what their habits of using language were, what their opinions of language and code switching were, and so on. So we administered questionnaires to all our participants. Then we came to transcribing the data. So we would transcribe on the go, actually, so we didn't wait until we collected all the data before transcribing. But transcribing the data takes a long time. It takes much longer than actually collecting the corpus itself. The main purpose of transcribing a corpus is that it makes analysing it much easier. I suppose in theory you could analyse a corpus which you haven't transcribed, but if you want to do any kind of searching for particular words or linguistic features, then it's an obvious first step to transcribe it. At least transcribe the bits that you want to look at, which is one approach if you have a large corpus and limited time. But we wanted to have completely transcribed corpora. We used the chat system of transcription, which is what is used by the LIDE system and the child databases and so on. You can read more about that in Queenie 2000, which meant that we transcribed and annotated all the utterances that speakers said, and also added additional information tiers, glossing every word, translating every utterance, and so on. As you will find out if you stick around for the workshop at the end, lots of aspects of real speech, of spoken language, informal spoken language particularly, make sentences and make language kind of harder to transcribe than you would imagine. Things like repetition and speaking on top of the other person and hesitation and incomplete sentences and all those kind of things are aspects of real speech that make transcription slightly challenging. So these will include things like repetition and reformulation, which is where you start a sentence and then halfway through you realise you used the wrong word, so you backtrack and repeat using a different word. We mark these with slashes in the transcription. I'll show you in a second. People use lots of interactional markers or interactional morphemes, like I did just there. Things like and o and and you have to transcribe all of these. You can't just ignore it. I mean, you could, but we didn't. And also you have things like speakers overlapping one another. So whilst one person is talking, the other person butts in, but the other person doesn't stop talking. So at certain points you have a contiguous speech where people are using speech at the same time. So somehow you have to transcribe that and express when the interruption happens, whether or not the original speaker completes their turn. And also, finally, you have things like language which might be turned ungrammatical. So sometimes speakers produce language which is non-standard, which might be incorrect according to either standard language or even incorrect according to most grammars of that language. And maybe the speaker notices and changes, maybe the speaker doesn't notice and plows on regardless. The crucial thing about transcribing data, spoken data for a corpus, is that you have to just accept what is said and interpret what they say, and then transcribe that. It's not your place as a transcriber to make judgments about how correct or incorrect their language is. And so all this kind of thing makes transcribing quite challenging, but ultimately worth it, because you get a large body of data which represent how people actually talk. And it's very interesting to read through the corpus conversations sometimes, because you see that people really don't speak in complete sentences. They don't always have a finite verb. They don't always speak without hesitation or repetition. This is an example from two transcriptions or two conversations in the Siarad Welsh-English corpus. Now you'll see some features of this transcription system. So these tiers where you have the three-letter acronyms like HEC and HYW and ADA over there, these are the participants' pseudonyms. So we gave pseudonyms to each participant and abbreviated them. This is the actual sentence that they say there, and it's transcribed in full. Then you have a gloss tier there, the GLS tier, which gives you information about the main tier. It includes morphological information. So, for example, this gloss is the verb dudin or din. So the bracketed information is part of the word that they don't produce. So the speaker said din, but it's marked in the transcription as dudin as the full form. And it says there in the gloss that it's the third person plural present form of to be, in much, and so on. You'll also see some things like this is the interruption marker. So Howell here interrupts whatever the Adam is saying with oh yeah. Here you see the two slashes there indicate that the speaker reformulates what he's saying halfway through. So he starts saying maion, he is, and then he corrects himself to saying oiddo, he was. And also you see things like when they produce non-linguistic sounds, like laughing and coughing, you have to know that as well. Because we are analysing code switching, it was important for us to be able to mark the language of the utterances. For example, the Siarad corpus, we wanted to mark every word as to say which language it was, Welsh or English. So some words are obviously Welsh or English. Trafodaeth is obviously a Welsh word. Germs is obviously an English word. But sometimes you get words which combine morphemes from both. So yieldio, to yield, then speakers use the English stem yield and the Welsh suffix, morphological verbalizing suffix yon. So you separate them with an underscore and use this kind of tag which shows that it's a morpheme with both English and Welsh elements in it. Some words are ambiguous because they are probably originally borrowings from English into Welsh and are homophones. So words like well and odd are basically homophones in Welsh and English, certainly in the speech of Welsh and English bilinguals they are. So we tag them with an @su, which shows that they could be from either language, is what that means. So this shows that sometimes when two languages interacting, such as in this bilingual speech, have similar grammars or similar phonologies, that can cause complexity. This is similar to something that Michael Klein, for example, commented on in his study of Dutch-English bilinguals, where Dutch and English share lots of similar words, like is and the. English is similar to Dutch duh. So when you're transcribing, sometimes it's hard to tell whether or not a given word is according to the speaker, from language A or language B. Also, there are issues with clause division, or splitting up the sentences. So, for example, not all sentences, not all clauses produced by people in real life have finite verbs, so what do you do there? Here are some examples. So, somebody could just say, kedadadra, which means walking home. That's a non-finite verbal noun, so you have to classify it, tag it as a non-finite clause, and not a finite clause. Or dyma ni, which means here we are. Literally, here is us in Welsh. Dyma is just a demonstrative of some kind, it's not a verb, but in Welsh it's viable, so you class that as some kind of verbless clause, right? And in terms of, sometimes you get a turn, a linguistic turn, where speakers will express what they want to speak from start to finish, and it doesn't represent a single clause, it might represent different clause. So when you're transcribing particularly, but also when you're analysing, you have to decide how you're splitting up your data. So for example, in a sentence such as a ffordd mae Blair wedi newid ei iaith a ffordd mae'n siarad am peth rili, which means the way Blair has changed the language and the way he talks about the matter really, that's multiple clauses, so you have to decide how you're splitting it up in your transcription. So one way of doing it would be to split it into two coordinating clauses like that. Ffordd mae Blair wedi newid ei iaith, and then the next tier, the next clause you have is a ffordd mae'n siarad am peth really, and you have to decide where you're putting this coordinating conjunction, and we decided arbitrarily to stick them at the beginning of the second coordinating clause. So there's much more complexity I could go into about clause division and clause categorization, but that's the kind of challenge that you face when you're dealing with speakers who produce lots of unusual, in terms of standard language, sentences. And just to give you an idea of how not everybody speaks in finite clauses, this is just a breakdown of the clauses that I analysed for one of my studies in my PhD thesis. Out of the 3,275 clauses that I looked at, only just half of them were actual finite clauses. 29% of them had no verb, and 14% of them had just a non-finite verb and not a finite verb. So because I was looking for finite clauses to analyse, I was only able to really analyse properly half of those clauses from the transcriptions that I selected. Okay, so I've talked about the methodology that we use to collect the corpora. Now I want to quickly talk to you about two studies that I've been involved with which use corpus data, and to give you an idea of the kind of research that you can do, or that is possible using corpus data. So the first one I'm going to talk about is an analysis of code switching and convergence that I did for my PhD thesis, and the second one I want to present to you is an analysis of code switching patterns across different bilingual communities, which is most recently published in the Journal of Language Context by Carton et al. So the first study looked at code switching and convergence. So to give you a brief background, there's lots of discussion in the literature about whether or not code switching leads to language change. Clearly code switching has a role to play in lexical borrowing, but also it's been argued and demonstrated, I think, that code switching can also lead to what can be termed convergence. Convergence, grammatical convergence, linguistic convergence, is where two languages somehow become more similar to one another because of a language contact effect. So, for example, Schmidt, 2000, looked at the speech of Russian English bilingual children and found that when they switched English and Russian within the same sentences, they would use Russian words but use English grammar, so not use Russian case endings and so on, which shows that their speech, their code switching was more English than Russian, more towards English more than Russian. And so my question was, when bilinguals speak informally, okay, so they combine words, they do code switching, but is there also a combination of structure? Do they allow the grammar of the languages to intersect? So I wanted to ask, in Welsh-English for this study, how frequent is code switching for one thing, to see how often it happens, but also how frequent convergence is, how frequent this kind of interference between the grammars of the two languages is. And in order to do this, I thought, well, I need to analyse the grammatical frame of the clauses that speakers produce to see which language provides the grammar. Because if only one language tends to provide the grammar, then that could show that there is no convergence going on. So, the concept that I used for this study was that of the matrix language. This is a concept in bilingualism research where it is proposed that code-switching sentences have a base or matrix language which provides the structure for those languages. You can put in words from either language into that structure, but the structure will be from one language. So we're talking things like word order, aspects of morphology, and things like case significance. So the language in any code-switching clause that provides the structure, the grammar to that language, to that sentence, is called a matrix language. So in the sentence from a Welsh-English corpus, my Americans are more commercial, Americans are more commercial, you'll see that there are words from both Welsh and English in, so there's code-switching, there's mixing of words from both languages, but what language provides the grammar? Well, if we look at things in the sentence like the finite verb, that my is a Welsh finite verb, my comes before the subject of the verb, precedes the subject in the sentence, which is a typically Welsh word order. And so we can argue that this grammatical information points towards Welsh being the grammatical framework, the morphosyntactic frame for the words for the grammar in this sentence. And so Welsh is what we call the matrix language of this sentence. So if in a code-switching sentence one language is the source of the matrix language, one language provides the grammar, then that indicates that there is no convergence going on. But what happens if we find evidence for two languages providing grammar for a sentence? If we take a sentence such as, this is from an older corpus, this Welsh-English sentence, fi 'di bod i'r bus lle, which means I have been to the bus place. This is an odd sentence grammatically. In Welsh we would expect something like lle bus, because in Welsh the adjective follows the noun, but in English the adjective precedes the noun typically. And so what seems to have happened here, the modifier precedes the noun. So what's happened here is the modifier precedes the noun in a sentence that is otherwise has Welsh grammatical elements. It has the Welsh aspectual marker and the verbal noun, for example. And so there is contradiction here between Welsh providing some grammar and English providing some other grammar. So I argue that this kind of sentence shows convergence to English, and the label I used for this kind of sentence is a dichotomous matrix language. Dichotomous because there's evidence that goes both ways, or two ways, for the matrix language of this clause. So what I would like to do is to see how frequent this kind of sentence is in speech, and if it is frequent, then that would be an argument for convergence being quite widespread. So the way we used the corpus was that I did a quantitative analysis of clauses. So I extracted clauses to see what the most frequent matrix language was, so whether or not Welsh or English was most frequent as the base language, the language that provides grammar for the clauses produced by these speakers. And then I wanted to see how common convergence was by looking at the frequency of dichotomous matrix language clauses. So I took data from 6 speakers from 3 conversations and analysed finite clauses. This is the kind of spreadsheet that you end up with this kind of analysis. So you see that I extracted the clauses and then labelled them for matrix language. And this is the results, the one set of results. So this is looking at all the finite clauses. These include both code switching and monolingual clauses, right? Clauses with code switching and without code switching for this chart. And you can see that Welsh provides 95% of matrix language in 95% of clauses, whereas English only provides matrix language in 4.5% of clauses. You'll also see that dichotomous matrix language Clauses where there is convergence are extremely rare. I mean, 0.1% is negligible. It's error, probably. So, if you look at all the clauses, Welsh provides most, English provides only some. But I wanted to see further if convergence, or if there was a difference if we only looked at code-switching clauses. So only clauses where there are morphemes, there are words from more than one language. And this is what we end up with there. So you'll see that English is never the matrix language in code-switching clauses. There are never sentences produced by these speakers which have Welsh and English words, but an English grammatical phrase. That doesn't happen. So Welsh, discounting the pseudo-dichotomous matrix language clauses for the time being, Welsh is by far the most frequent provider, in fact, basically the only provider of morphosyntax for clauses produced by the Welsh-English bilinguals that I looked at. So we could use that as arguments for a couple of things. Because Welsh is the only language selected for matrix language and code switching, and because dichotomous matrix language clauses are very rare, even if you look at the whole 40 hours of the Siarad corpus, you only find about 14, last count. This suggests that in Welsh-English speech, at least, the fact that speakers are code switching doesn't mean that they are that the English language is affecting the grammar of Welsh or vice versa. The structured morphosyntax of the speech of these speakers is quite robust. So that's one study that used corpus data. This is a slightly different study that nevertheless still uses the matrix language principle. So this looks at code switching patterns across different communities. So we've already looked at one type of difference between code switching, which is that you can have intrasentential and intersentential, whether or not the code switching happens inside a sentence or from one sentence to another. And that there is some evidence that shows that different communities will produce different types of code switching. So some communities are more likely to produce intrasentential, some are more likely to produce intersentential. These studies have demonstrated that there are other factors, social linguistic or extra-linguistic factors, that seem to control whether or not speakers produce intrasentential or intersentential code switching. These include things like proficiency, so how well the speakers speak both languages. Hoplack and Nortier, amongst others, have proved that speakers who are balanced or who have high proficiency in both their languages are more likely to produce intrasentential code switching, although Peredur Davies, who looked at French-Arabic bilinguals, found the opposite. So balanced bilinguals were more likely to have intersentential code switching. We're more likely, if you like, to have lots of sentences with matrix language from one language and lots of sentences with matrix language from another language. And secondly, is social identity, how speakers identify themselves. This seems to have a link to code switching as well. For example, Siarad looked at Arabic French bilinguals in Tunisia and found that speakers tended to switch to their dominant language when they wanted to express their identity. So we could argue that there is a link between code switching and the language which people identify with, if you like, most. So we posed the research question, does the kind of community, looking in these cases at the three communities, does the kind of community affect the code switching patterns of bilinguals? So we looked at what language speakers selected as matrix language, so very similar to the study that I just showed about Welsh, but now for the three corpora. And wanted to look at whether or not speakers tend to just select one language for the matrix language of their clauses, or whether or not they were happy to use either. And so the hypothesis, we posed two hypotheses, so it would be possible to pose two hypotheses about this. Firstly, to do with proficiency. So with proficiency is linked to matrix language choice, that speakers, you could hypothesize, would prefer the language they are most dominant in as matrix language. If they are balanced bilinguals, they can use either, which would reflect the findings of, for example, Peredur Davies. Another hypothesis would link to identity, so going by findings of people like Siarad, if speakers are identify most closely with one particular language, they will prefer that language as their matrix language. So again, we extracted clauses from the three corpora, the Miami, Wales, and Patagonia data. We labeled the ML, identified the matrix language of each clause, and then codified and measured the questionnaire data relating to identity and proficiency for all the speakers in all three corpora, so that we could get an idea of the community norms, if you like, the normal identity and average proficiency of people in those communities, and see how the matrix language choice patterned with those extra-linguistic aspects. Now these are the results that we get from matrix language. So this is what I've already shown you. The Welsh data shows that speakers pick Welsh to be the matrix language 95% of the time. If you look at the Miami data, speakers pick Spanish and English equally to be the matrix language. There's a very stark difference between the two. If you go down to Patagonia, the difference is less stark, but they still prefer Welsh as the matrix language, although they do use Spanish as the matrix language in 19% of clauses. So clearly there is a difference between these three groups, the three communities, in the way that they code switch and the matrix language choices that they make. So, what role does proficiency play? Well, if we look at the proficiency reported, this is self-reported, so we ask them the questionnaires for people to say how well they think they speak Welsh and English and so on. In Wales and Miami, the majority of speakers claim to be balanced bilingual, so they claim to be as good in language A as they are in language B. But in Patagonia, well, 47% of the speakers there report to be balanced bilinguals. The majority report to be dominant in Spanish, so most people there report that they are better in Spanish than they are in Welsh. So we have a difference here, in that Miami and Wales have balanced bilinguals, but Patagonia don't have so much. And if you look at identity, the kind of patterns you see are also quite different. So in Wales, almost everybody identifies as being Welsh. In Patagonia, the majority of people self-identify as something South American, something Argentinian or Patagonian. Most people do not identify as Welsh, or if they do identify as Welsh, they tick two boxes. They say, I am Welsh and Argentinian or something. Whereas in Miami, you get a lot of variety. Many people define as Hispanic or even Spanish or American, but 46% of people picked in other categories, so they are Nicaraguan or Dominican or Cuban or something like that. So there's a lot of variety in the identity in Miami compared to the other places. So if we return to the hypotheses and return to the matrix language distribution, looking at hypothesis 1, which argued that balanced bilinguals would show variation in matrix language, whereas bilinguals who are dominant in one language would pick that language as their matrix language. This is upheld in Miami because the speakers are balanced bilinguals usually, and they show a lot of variation in the matrix language. They pick either English or Spanish equally. In Wales, the speakers are also balanced, but they always pick Welsh as matrix language, so that's an issue we have to think about. This could be related to some kind of structural factors. For example, the grammar of Welsh and English, the basic word order of Welsh and English, are more different to one another than the basic word order of Spanish and English, so that might be a feature. And in Patagonia, the speakers are Spanish dominant, but they prefer Welsh. So that's perhaps counterintuitive and certainly goes against the hypothesis. But this could be related to things like the high status of Welsh in Patagonia, that they treat it with high prestige, and so if they get an opportunity to speak it, they will prefer it, if you like, as a matrix language. And also, it could be argued that because they are aware they're being recorded, they want to put on their best, their best Sunday clothes and speak their best Welsh. That might have happened. And if we go back to the second hypothesis to do with identity, Wales shows uniform identity. Almost everybody identifies as Welsh, and again we have uniform Welsh matrix language. Now this is a very clear aspect of the Welsh corpus, and so maybe identity is the critical factor that affects the choice of matrix language by Welsh speakers. It overrides the proficiency aspect, if you like. In Miami, you get variable identity and variable matrix language, so that upholds the hypothesis as well. So there isn't a fixed identity which everybody in Miami has, and this is reflected in the fact that there is no fixed ML that everybody uses. Again, Patagonia is different. It's fairly uniform in terms of identity, but, well, the matrix language choice kind of matches it. So, again, we could argue that maybe Patagonian speakers have some kind of purist ideology. They identify with their country, Argentina, Patagonia, but they choose Welsh because they have it holds a high prestige for them. So the conclusions that we draw, the proficiency and identity do play a role in the matrix language choice of bilinguals, and it will vary from community to community, but it does depend on other factors, including things like in the special case in Patagonia. So we'll have to take that into account. So this is the last slide. The benefits of a corpus approach is that it allows you to measure the linguistic variable synchronically in actual speech. Right? So this is arguably as real as you can get in linguistic research. If you're wanting real speech data, a corpus collected in this kind of approach is one of the most suitable avenues. And in terms of analysis, it allows for quantitative and also qualitative analysis, and you can look at as many or as few speakers as you like, and for whatever variables you like. But there are some constraints. Collecting a corpus is very labour intensive. It took us 3 years to collect one of them. It's often coded or tagged for a specific purpose, so our corpora are tagged for code switching and not for things like mutation. Well, so if you're interested in mutation, it is useful, but not as useful as it will be if you're interested in code switching. And also, not every research question should be answered with corpus data. There are some research questions which are probably better suited to experimental approaches, for example. So whatever you do when you set out to collect your corpora, good luck, but try and bear in mind the things that we learned from collecting our corpora. Thank you. Please ask questions and then stay for the little workshop if you